So again, in this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to continue just doing kind of some discernment, some revisiting of both our model of why our community exists and why it does things the way in which it does, and just kind of what our hope is for creating rhythms in which we're hopefully inviting God into forming us into being the kind of people He wants us to be. So again, kind of the model we use is right here, in which the center is worship, and we talked about that last week. All the things that worship can include, not just our time together on Sundays of worship, but any practice which makes us intentionally aware of God's presence, including some things that don't, traditionally look like they're very spiritual. The outside of the ring is, of course, mission. It's when we go out into the world where we live most of our normal lives intentionally, just meeting people and inviting people where they're at into kind of this liminal space, this middle space, in which I think there's some more depth, but which is also kind of inviting people into our lives and into again, the life that God wants us to. So again, we talked about worship last week. This week we're going to be on kind of that first of those liminal spaces, which is service. So let me just talk about service and kind of what we mean by service at Wayfarers and why it is such an intentional rhythm. I think most of the time people think of service, they think about volunteering. And volunteering is great. I've worked with many nonprofits. I know they need volunteers, and that's great. I think most of us, however, do not volunteer on a regular enough basis for it to actually affect our spiritual lives, to actually change who we are. And I would argue that one of the kind of core practices of what we do up there with worship and prayer, reading the Bible, etc., is service and making sure our lives are other focused. There's just really no way around this foundational aspect of Christianity, and that's making ourselves about loving others. But again, for Wayfarers, we define it maybe a little more loosely. It doesn't have to be something as big as volunteering. So in this in this kind of little discernment pamphlet, for us, serving is both an action and an attitude. We make ourselves available to interruption, to being asked for help, and we cultivate a daily awareness of the needs and wants of others so we can initiate and offer ways to serve them. We also recognize the need to volunteer and work with groups fighting the major social evils of our day. So again, volunteering is important. We should probably all be doing it more than we currently are. But there's also an attitude of small things being available for interruption, not thinking we're so important, for being the types of people that people will feel comfortable asking for help, even though in our culture we hate asking for help. We want to always make sure we can, anytime we ask for help, we want to make sure we're going to receive help in exchange, make sure the ledger's even and all that. We want to be the kind of people that people aren't afraid to ask for help when we need it, but we also want to be the kind of people that know the lives of the people around us, whether it's coworkers or neighbors, our friends, our family, maybe even people we don't like. We just kind of can see their needs and their wants, and so we ask them, "Can I help you with this? Can I serve with this?" Which, of course, you're hearing. Some of it's going to be big in important ways. Others are going to be kind of smaller, maybe it's just giving a compliment, noticing the work someone is doing, etc. Another way we've talked about that is just simply blessing, extending the goodness we've received from God to others. And so the question, we always have serving or blessing others as one of the major rhythms. We try to intentionally make sure we're doing this at least a couple of times a week, 3 times a week in our weekly rhythms. And so the kind of questions, the verses we're going to be spending time with this week in prayer and discernment are this passage out of John chapter 13, which Jesus washes his disciples' feet when he again shows service is the ultimate expression of love. So let me read that. Let me read the questions we'll be going through this week to just kind of guide our own discernment. Jesus knew the Father had given everything into his hands, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the table and took off his robes. Picking up a linen towel, he tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he was wearing. After he washed the disciples' feet, he put on his robes and returned to his place at the table. And he said to them, "Do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you speak correctly because I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too must wash each other's feet. I have given you an example. Just as I have done, you also must do. I assure you, servants aren't greater than their master, nor are those who are sent greater than the one who sent them. Since you know these things, you will be happy if you do them. I assure you that whoever receives someone I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me." And so these are the questions that will kind of define our 4 different days of discernment, of sitting and meditating on this passage. Why does the story start with Jesus' connection to the Father? Do your acts of service flow from your love of God or from a sense of obligation? What are some examples of how you serve others and the world? Do you think God is calling you into anything new? Do you see any strong needs in our city, society, or world? Write a few ideas. How might the Wayfarers community engage in serving beside you in this need? And finally, has your discernment this week stirred any new ideas or dreams for our community? So again, on Sunday, we're going to be sharing just some of our own thoughts and see what God stirred up through our discernment, looking at worship specifically. And then we'll kind of be jumping into thoughts or questions on this idea of serving, which we'll look at together next week.